September 19, 1991. Two German hikers, Helmut and Ötzi the Iceman, are crossing a high ridge in the Ötzi Alps, right on the border between Austria and Italy. The altitude is over 10,500 feet. The air is thin, the light is sharp, and the glacier beneath their boots has been retreating for years, pulling back like a blanket being slowly tugged off a bed. And then Helmut sees it. A shape, dark against the ice. A human torso, face down, half frozen in a shallow gully, arms positioned as if reaching for something. They assume it is a dead mountaineer. A recent tragedy. Someone who fell and never came home. They were wrong by about 5,300 years. That body belonged to a man who died around 3,300 BCE. Not the Middle Ages, not the Roman Empire, the Copper Age. Before the pyramids were conceived, before Stonehenge was finished, before writing existed anywhere in Europe. He had been sealed inside that glacier for so long that the entire arc of Western civilization rose and fell while he lay frozen, face down, with an arrowhead still lodged in his left shoulder. They named him Ötzi, after the Tyrolean Alps. And for 3 decades, scientists have studied every single detail of his existence, with an intensity usually reserved for crime scenes. His last meal, still sitting in his stomach. His diseases, mapped from his bones and his gut. His 61 tattoos, the oldest known in the world. His copper axe, his flint dagger, the grass stuffed into his leather shoes for warmth. They know what parasites lived inside him. They know which shoulder was struck by the arrow that killed him. They know he was right-handed. We know more about this one man than we know about entire civilizations that came after him. But the thing that quietly unsettled everyone, the thing that still does not have a clean answer, was not his cause of death, or his clothing, or his last meal. It was his blood, his code, his DNA. Because when they finally read it properly, he did not match anyone. Not modern Europeans, not ancient ones, not his own neighbors, buried in the same mountains, from the same era, living the same kind of life. His genetic signature was, and largely remains, a lineage of one. A man surrounded by people, and yet standing completely alone in the genetic record. And that fact, which sounds like a footnote in an archaeology paper, is actually the part that should keep you up at night. Because it says something about how thin the thread is that connects any of us to the future. Let me explain. When Ötzi was first recovered, the science was young. Ancient DNA technology barely existed. It took years before researchers could extract usable genetic material from his remains, and when they finally published his first full genome in 2012, the results seemed to make sense. He appeared to carry ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, that vast sweep of grassland stretching across southeastern Europe and into Central Asia. His DNA looked a lot like modern Sardinians. He seemed to fit neatly into the European story. Except there was a problem. A quiet one that took a decade to surface. Steppe ancestry, the kind they found in Ötzi's genome, did not arrive in Central Europe until about 4,900 years ago. Ötzi died 5,300 years ago. He was too old for his own DNA. That should have been a red flag. It was. In 2023, a team led by Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology went back to the beginning. They took new samples directly from Ötzi's exposed hip bone and sequenced his genome again, this time with technology that had improved beyond recognition. And what they found changed his face, his story, and his place in history. The steppe ancestry was gone. Completely. The 2012 genome had been contaminated with modern human DNA, and that contamination had painted a false picture that stood uncorrected for over a decade. The real Ötzi, the one hiding beneath the noise, was something else entirely. About 90% of his ancestry came from Anatolian farmers. the people who left what is now Turkey thousands of years earlier and slowly spread agriculture across Europe. That alone was not shocking. What was shocking was how pure that signal was. Almost no trace of the hunter-gatherers who had roamed Europe for tens of thousands of years before those farmers arrived. Almost no trace of anyone else at all. Ötzi came from a group that had stayed remarkably isolated. While most of Europe was already mixing, blending, absorbing waves of newcomers, his people had held still. Genetically, they were almost frozen, long before the glacier did the same to his body. And that was only the beginning of the strangeness. Every human carries two genetic stories. One from their father's line, passed through the Y chromosome. One from their mother's line, passed through mitochondrial DNA, that small loop of code inherited only from your mother, who inherited it from hers, stretching back in an unbroken chain for thousands of generations. When researchers examined Ötzi's mitochondrial DNA, they found he belonged to a branch of the K1 lineage. About 8% of modern Europeans carry some version of K. But Ötzi's version did not fit into any of the three known branches. Not K1A, not K1B, not K1C. He belonged to a fourth branch, one that had never been seen before. They gave it a provisional name, K1O, the O for Ötzi, because he was the only known member. Later, it was formally classified as K1F. A lineage with a single known occupant. A branch on the vast human family tree with one single leaf. They searched databases of modern European DNA. Thousands of samples, tens of thousands. Nothing. They compared against other ancient genomes from across the continent, from every era, every region. Nothing. For years, the conclusion was simple and unsettling. Ötzi's direct maternal line appeared to be extinct. The chain of mothers that stretched back through him into deep prehistory seemed to have ended. Somewhere, at some point, the last woman carrying that code either died without daughters, or her daughter's daughters eventually gave way to other lines, and the signal vanished from the human record like a voice swallowed by wind. Think about what that means for a moment. Not as science, as a human fact. Someone's mother carried that code, and her mother before her, and hers before that. An unbroken chain of women, stretching back thousands of years, each one passing it forward through the simple act of having a daughter who survived long enough to have a daughter of her own. Until it stopped. Until there was no one left to carry it. And the only reason we know it ever existed at all is because a glacier held one man's body in place for 5 millennia, while everything around him, every lineage, every population, every world, changed beyond recognition. Now, here is where the story goes, somewhere no one expected. And honestly, this is the part that moved me the most. In 2025, a team of researchers published a major study in Nature Communications. They had analyzed the genomes of 47 people who lived in the Tyrolean Alps across a span of 5,000 years, from roughly 6,400 to 1,300 BCE. These were Ötzi's neighbors, not in the casual sense. These were people buried in the same mountains, during the same era, living the same kind of life. And at first, the results looked familiar. Like Ötzi, most of these individuals had 80 to 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry. They had dark hair, brown eyes. They were lactose intolerant, which means they could not digest milk, a trait that would not shift in Europe for another 1,000 years. Genetically, they looked like a community that had remained remarkably stable for over 2,000 years, while the rest of Europe was being reshaped by migration after migration. But when the researchers looked more closely, when they traced the paternal and maternal lines individually, Ötzi stood alone. His Y chromosome, the paternal marker, belonged to a lineage called GL91. It is vanishingly rare today. When scientists at Innsbruck Medical University tested over 3,700 modern Tyrolean men, only 19 shared that same paternal line. 19 out of thousands, less than 0.5%. And among those 47 ancient Alpine individuals, not one of them carried Ötzi's paternal lineage. Not one carried his maternal lineage either. I need you to understand how strange that is. They tested his neighbors. People who lived in the same mountains during the same centuries, with the same broad ancestry, the same dark hair, the same inability to digest milk, the same tools, and the same way of life. 47 of them, spanning 5,000 years. And his family lines, both his father's side and his mother's side, matched none of them. He was among them, but he was not of them. That is not a small finding. That is a man standing in a crowd where everyone looks like him, speaks like him, eats like him, and yet carries a completely different story in his blood. A story that, as far as anyone can tell, no one else in those mountains was carrying. Not before him, not after. If you have been enjoying this journey into the deep past with us, consider subscribing. There are stories like this waiting in every corner of the ancient world, and we are only getting started. Valentina Koya, a researcher at the Institute for Mummy Studies in Bolzano, was careful about what this means. She pointed out that the absence of his lineage could mean it went extinct, but it could also mean something else. Maybe Ötzi came from a different group of Anatolian farmers, a group that arrived in the Alps by a different route, or at a slightly different time, and whose specific family lines simply did not take root in the broader local population. In other words, maybe he was not a local who happened to be genetically unusual. Maybe he was a newcomer, a man whose people passed through and left almost no lasting trace, except for one body in the ice. That possibility is haunting, because it reframes everything. His copper axe, his high-altitude equipment, his solitary death on a mountain pass with an arrow in his back. Was he a man moving between worlds? Was the violence that killed him connected to the fact that he did not quite belong? We cannot know. But the genetics open a door that was not open before, because it means the Alps, which were already a genetic refuge, a place where ancient farming populations held on longer than almost anywhere else in Europe, while the rest of the continent was reshaped by migration, may have been even more complex than anyone realized. Not one stream of farmers slowly settling a mountain range over centuries, but multiple streams arriving at different times, from different directions, overlapping, coexisting, sometimes merging, and then, for some, quietly disappearing without a trace. And the only evidence that one of those streams ever existed, the only proof that those particular people ever lived and walked and climbed these mountains, is Ötzi. One man, one body, one frozen accident of preservation. Now let me tell you something about his body that most people miss when they hear this story. Ötzi was about 45 years old when he died. He stood roughly 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighed about 110 pounds. He had worn joints, hardened arteries, gallstones, gum disease, and a stomach full of bacteria that would have given him ulcers. He had been sick at least 3 times in the 6 months before his death. The marks are visible in his fingernails. Little horizontal lines called Bow's lines. Each one a record of a period when his body was under so much stress that it temporarily stopped growing his nails. He had 61 tattoos, not decorative ones, not art. Small groups of parallel lines and crosses, inked by hand with soot pressed into punctured skin, placed at his lower spine, his knees, his ankles, his wrists. Almost all of them sit over joints that X-rays later showed were damaged or arthritic. They were placed where he hurt. 5,300 years ago, someone sat with this man and pressed dark pigment into his skin at the exact points where his body was failing him. We do not know if it helped. We do not know what they believed it did. But the oldest known tattoos in the world were not decoration. They were someone trying to ease someone else's pain. He carried a copper axe with a U-handle, a weapon so valuable and so difficult to produce that it almost certainly marked him as a person of status. He had a longbow, a quiver of arrows, a flint dagger, a grass net, and a leather pouch. His clothes were stitched together from ibex, chamois, and deerskin. His shoes were lined with grass for insulation. He was not wandering. He was equipped. He was somebody. And his last meal, eaten roughly an hour before he died, was a heavy one. Dried ibex meat, red deer, einkorn wheat. A mountain meal, high in fat, the kind you eat when you know the climb ahead is long. He ate it sitting down, unhurried. He did not know that someone was behind him. The arrow entered his left shoulder from a distance of roughly 100 yards, severed an artery, and caused blood loss that would have been fatal even with modern medicine. His right hand bore a deep defensive wound from a fight days earlier. He may have won that one. He did not win this one. His copper axe was left beside him. Whoever killed him did not take it. This was not robbery. This was personal. And then the ice came and held him for 5,300 years, while everything he knew vanished from the earth. There is something else that should be said here, because it changes the way you picture this man. For over 30 years, every reconstruction of Ötzi showed him with pale skin and a full head of long, unkempt hair. That image was based on the 2012 genome, the contaminated one. When Krauss's team resequenced him in 2023, the picture changed completely. And this was not unusual. This was normal for his time. Light skin in Europe is recent, astonishingly recent. The genes that code for it did not become widespread until roughly 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years after Ötzi died. Before that, for tens of thousands of years, the people on this continent were dark-skinned. As Johannes Krauss put it, people in Europe between 40,000 and 8,000 years ago had skin as dark as people in Africa. Which makes complete sense. That is where humans came from. The lightning happened slowly, driven by changing diets over thousands of years. Ötzi was living in the middle of that transition. The man in the ice does not look the way you were taught to imagine him. The pale, shaggy-haired figure from every museum reconstruction and documentary was a fiction built on contaminated DNA. The real Ötzi was dark, balding, weathered, covered in marks of pain. And he looked far more like the world he actually came from than the world we projected onto him. We made him look like us. He never did. And then, in 2025, something strange happened. A man named Ötzi submitted his DNA to a genetic database. His mitochondrial DNA, that maternal code passed down from mother to child across millennia, carried the same defining mutations as Ötzi's. Both markers that had classified Ötzi's lineage as unique, as K1F, were present in Ötzi's code, along with 3 additional mutations that had accumulated over the intervening centuries. The extinct lineage was not extinct. I want you to sit with that for a second. For nearly 2 decades, every scientist who studied Ötzi's maternal line reached the same conclusion. Gone, finished, a dead branch. Then a man in a completely different part of the world submitted a saliva sample to a database, and the branch grew a leaf. Ötzi's maternal grandmother was Shawiya Berber from northeastern Algeria. The Berber populations of North Africa carry a complex mix of ancient local ancestry and DNA from Neolithic farmers who spread from the Near East into both Europe and North Africa thousands of years ago. The same farming expansion that shaped Ötzi also reached across the Mediterranean, and somewhere in that other branch of the migration, carried by people who turned south instead of north, the maternal line survived. Not in the Alps, not in Europe at all. In North Africa. carried quietly through a completely different chain of mothers, across a completely different geography, through completely different empires and upheavals, for 5,000 years. The connection does not mean Ötzi was Hetty's ancestor. Mitochondrial DNA does not work that way. What it means is that somewhere deep in prehistory, a woman existed whose daughters split in two directions. One line went north, into the mountains, into the cold, and ended with Ötzi or somewhere near him. The other line went south, across the sea, into the heat of North Africa, and survived. Two branches of the same ancient mother, separated by a sea, 5,000 years, and every assumption anyone had ever made about where this story would end. One frozen in a glacier, one alive today. I keep coming back to the glacier, not the science. The glacier itself, the way it held him, the way it kept every detail in place, his last meal still in his stomach, his blood cells still intact, the arrowhead still buried in his shoulder, while 5,300 years of human history played out above him. Empires rose, languages were born and died. The light skin he never had spread slowly across an entire continent. The farming world he came from was overwritten, replaced, absorbed by wave after wave of newcomers who brought new codes and erased old ones. And through all of it, he lay there, face down, arms positioned as if reaching for something he never found. The glacier did not know it was preserving the only evidence that an entire maternal lineage ever walked this earth. It did not know that without this one body, in this one gully, at this one altitude, a whole branch of the human family tree would have vanished without a trace. No one would have known to look for it. No one would have known it was missing. That is what unsettles me. Not that Ötzi's DNA does not match anyone, but that if two hikers had taken a different path that day in September of 1991, we would never have known it existed at all. September 19th. A shape in the ice. A man whose DNA did not match anyone, whose lineage seemed to have vanished from the earth, whose face was wrong in every portrait we ever painted of him. A man who carried 61 marks of pain on his body and ate a heavy meal without knowing it was his last. Who was killed by someone who did not even take his axe. 5,300 years, and the code barely survived. A thread that thin, stretched that far, through that much silence, and still here. What part of Ötzi's story unsettles you the most? His loneliness in the genetic record, or the fact that his lineage survived in a place no one thought to look?